After some stodgy displays and some questionable performances, United absolutely dominated against Middlesbrough. And I feel that we did that by making a slight tweak through our midfield, which transformed our structure off the ball, making sure that they weren't able to control the game, they weren't able to get their passing game running, they weren't able to create chances, but it also completely transformed our progression and our build-up. From the team who'd been unable to hold the ball, unable to really create chances against Hull, against Derby, against Portsmouth, we very quickly became a team who were able to get key men on the ball much faster and in much better positions. But the question we're trying to answer here today is, how? Ole, ole, ole. Ole, ole, ole. Ole, ole, ole. To set the scene, against Portsmouth, United had really allowed themselves to get penned in. With the midfield pairing of Souza and 𝗬𝗿𝗄, it was a really unbalanced midfield that United had put together. They were two players who were trying to do the same job. They, generally speaking, were occupying the same space, but also they weren't really the players who were going to give you direct ball progression. When they're picking up the ball, they're not going to be able to take it in a half space, turn, and then find a progressive pass to take us into the attacking third, rather than just knocking it around our defence aimlessly and not able to really create those chances getting forwards. Portsmouth, the way that they counteracted sort of United trying to pack midfield was they played over the top. They used 𝗬𝗿𝗵𝗴, their large number 9, to back up United's two centre-halves. He pushed 𝗬𝗿𝗏, he pushed Jack Robinson a little bit deeper than they wanted to be with his physical strength. He usually was the man who was going to win those first balls, but even if he didn't, because the defence was so deep, he'd opened up a wide gap between those midfielders and that centre-half partnership. That meant that Portsmouth could really charge in to try and use that space, try and win the second balls, and really make it a battle rather than a game where United's technical ability would stand out. Where we saw that most effective was that as United's defence pushed deeper, they could try and win those second balls, but the main aim was to get the ball to 𝗬𝗏𝗴 out on the left wing. He'd got a little bit of space to run into because Clark had dropped deep with the defence, and that meant by the time he was one-on-one with Clark, he'd built up a head of steam. He was ready to go past him and he was using his pace while Clark was still on the turn and usually had been left in the dust, giving him an easy cross to create all of those chances that we saw in United's box. So what did United do differently against Boro? How did we try and address that context to win the game differently? Well, United made quite a simple change to most eyes because it was straightforward. We brought in Callum O'Hare and we brought in 𝗬𝗐𝗍, both of whom had a huge impact on the way that United were proactive off the ball because both of them are energetic and are quite high in their press, but also gave us greater control and progression on the ball because they're both players who are comfortable taking a touch, taking a moment, and then finding the right pass to try and get United playing forwards rather than constantly coming backwards and inviting pressure onto the defence. The way that we structured that midfield, particularly off the ball, I would say, for this first player, was that Vinny Souza just sat deep. He covered every time that Middlesbrough tried to play on a counter, every time they wanted to come forward, he made sure that we had that freedom that we weren't going to let them come through. So Souza was able to dominate that role by playing in the space on his own. There was nobody else who was in his way. There was nobody else who was saying, well, you cover this side, I'll cover that. It was just Vinny Souza, when the ball comes into United's half, go and win it. Go and make sure that their midfielders aren't given the time, the space to create. And we saw him constantly getting back, winning the ball off the wingers, winning the ball off the 𝗍𝗏𝗏 even at times. He was just dominant in that game. Whenever Middlesbrough tried to go through the counter, whether it was Hackney who was coming forward and going through the lines, or the balls down the wings, Souza was quickly over closing down the space. It meant United always had a defensive overload and Middlesbrough weren't able to do what they do best, in all honesty, which is very quickly get from one end of the pitch to the other and start putting dangerous crosses into the box. It really meant that Boro never got out. So every time they were trying to play into their front players, Souza was there covering that extra little space, doubling up with either the right back, the left back, even one of the centre-halves at times. And it meant that they couldn't create that control in the way that Portsmouth had done that. So they always made sure they got time on the ball, whereas to counter it against Boro, we made sure they had no time on the ball. That extra defensive freedom just meant that he had his best game for me. I think it's probably the best game. It's definitely his best game since he got injured against Sunderland, but it's arguably his best game of the season because he was just so effective. Every single time you thought that Boro maybe could create something, Souza was there. He was always the man who was putting the pressure on, winning the ball back, At one point, he just tackled nobody because he seemed to get a little bit bored. He was like, there's nobody to tackle here. I'll slide in anyway, make sure nobody gets it, let it go out for a throw-in. And I think that just about summed up Souza's game because he was just a defensive monster. So his partner playing just in front of him, actually, in this structure was 𝗍𝗍𝗫. And I'm going to call him the disruptor of the team. Because while Souza was the defensive destroyer, what we actually had in 𝗍𝗍𝗫 was somebody who was chasing down the second ball and was the first response to their progressive passing to try and come through midfield. Every time they moved it from defence into their central midfield area, either Hackney or Morris, he was the first United player on the scene. The way that Boro tried to play out is they wanted a very quick build-up. So they wanted the centre-halves to get the ball, get it straight into Hackney or Morris, who will take the ball on the half turn. They'll then be able to spin and be moving forwards towards United's half, either finding a pass or dribbling straight through to commit a defender, building space for 𝗍𝗍𝗫 to be able to play into. They wanted to do that because clearly that's where they think they're most dangerous. They've got speed on the wings, they've got speed at centre forward, and they felt that was the way to really move United's backline around to create a little bit of organised chaos, shall we say. But with 𝗍𝗫's role as the disruptor, he really prevented that first stage of build-up. So whenever the centre-halves were trying to play it into midfield, he was always there to pressure them, make sure they can't just take the ball on the turn. They're always in a battle. They're always being competed with to make sure that it's no simple passes, no easy way of turning and controlling the ball. It meant that we also sometimes triggered high turnover, where he was supporting the front four by penning Middlesbrough back into their own half. Every time their midfield tried to receive it, if 𝗍𝗫's up behind them, it knocks them that little bit further back towards their own box and creates that extra feeling of panic where they're not able to get out and it's just constant United pressure. That meant that when Boro couldn't get out and couldn't play their normal game, they tried long balls. They then started trying to play it long over the top for 𝗍𝗍𝗫 or one of the wingers to run into space. But they couldn't do that because they didn't have the sort of profile of player in the same way that, say, Portsmouth had to try and win that ball physically. And so Robinson and 𝗍𝗫𝗫 were therefore quite comfortable in defending against that kind of play. It meant that United just had complete control of both the game and, in particular, that midfield battle because we had just nullified everything that Boro were trying to do. So, after such an effective and dominant performance from those two deeper midfielders, we then come to the three behind the striker and their role that when United had got the ball, we were creating chances, and arguably, I think that was our most creative game of the season. It was the first time that we've ever just completely dominated an opposition's defence, and to be honest, we scored 3. We were a little bit unlucky not to get more because particularly that first half, we were absolutely rampant. And I think one of the bits that was most notable about this was how much quicker United were getting the ball to 𝗍𝗏𝗼𝗲. He was always receiving the ball a little bit earlier. It meant that rather than being doubled up on, he usually had space when it came into his feet. And that meant he could either start to build up a head of steam and beat his man, or he could commit a player and fire a ball through that was just lovely through balls time and time again. He was picking those passes into the really dangerous areas. So we saw this particularly, let's say, the first goal. Boro, for the first time, tried to get forward. United then, as soon as we got the ball, to be fair, I think this one was a tackle. But let's say as soon as we got the ball, we knocked it into the channel because 𝗲𝗲 had the run on his man. He runs fantastically to keep the ball in, but then he's got free air in front of him. He's just got open space where he can start to dribble, take United forward. Meant one of the centre-halves has got to come across and commit himself to try and stop 𝗍𝗏𝗼𝗲, which opened up the space for him to thread that lovely through ball for Callum O'Hare. Now, Callum O'Hare should have just scored, should have picked the ball up and finished, but, fortunately, it didn't matter, and it fell to 𝗍𝗏𝗫 to knock in the back of the net. And I think that was a very clear tactical plan by United. We'd set that trap for Middlesbrough's defence, which was you've got to come and commit to 𝗲𝗲, but we're going to have O'Hare, Cannon and 𝗍𝗏𝗫 all trying to run and attack the space in behind your defenders, and it drew them out. And I thought that was really intelligent play. And I thought it was a really good plan by Wilder to make sure that we were always consistently hurting Middlesbrough with that game. I think as well on 𝗲𝗲's role, particularly because of where O'Hare was on the pitch, it meant he got so much more freedom in the way that they were interchanging. I think for the first time this season, we saw 𝗲𝗲𝗫 moving a lot more central. O'Hare was a lot more willing, I suppose, to drop out a little bit, to just give him that little bit of extra space so that 𝗲𝗲𝗫 was the one dictating the play. And I thought the way that their partnership worked in this game was outstanding and really drove United forwards to being, what I think on that performance, one of the best teams in the league by a mile. Now, generally speaking, I thought everybody was excellent. I thought United had a tactical plan which just worked perfectly. And I thought the players themselves all had 8+ out of 10 on the night because they were just fantastic in the way they applied the plan and made sure that Boro had absolutely nothing to go off. I think those three areas, though, were key. The tactical tweak that we made meant that we dominated with positional freedom for 𝗍𝗍𝗲𝗍. It meant that we got disrupting the press from 𝗍𝗍𝗫𝗍 and early receiving of the ball for 𝗣𝗍𝗲𝗍. And those three things ultimately were the bit that changed that game. That was the difference in the performance from Portsmouth to where we were against Middlesbrough. So, we learned a bit from United's midfield structure, but what did we actually learn from Boro's approach to the game? We know what they were roughly trying to do. We know that they really wanted to try and progress the ball from central defence into the midfield, receive the ball on the spin, and then start to feed their attackers. It was crucial to me how well we won that midfield battle. But I think actually what I learned more than anything else is how important the defensive structure with the ball is. Because when United were dominant for the majority of the game, we always had Souza, 𝗚𝗿𝗿, Robinson. They were covering. They made sure that if Clark had committed, somebody was on the right to cover that space, make sure the winger wasn't free. If Burrows committed down the left, similarly, Souza would drop in, make sure they had nowhere to just play out with an easy ball, creating an easy chance. Whereas Boro didn't do that almost at all. The 3 goals that United have actually scored in this game, well, at least the first 2 goals, while the game was very much in the balance, came from Boro's only periods of possession/ball progression. When Boro attacked, they wanted to get their wingers out, but they also did something that I would call United's sort of circa 2019 style, where the entire intention behind their attacking build-up was to create overloads down either wing. What they wanted was to get a winger one-on-one with his fullback, him to drag him right down as deep as he can towards his own area. You'd then have the wing-back come and follow him up, whether that was overlapping or underlapping, and a central midfielder would come across to create what they wanted to be a 3-on-2 scenario. You get a winger holding his man up, and then everybody else backs them in. One of them creates space, which then means you can whip the ball into the box, or you can play some of those intricate passes to create opportunities and half spaces within the box to get a shot off. So that's what they were trying to do. But the way that it worked in this game is that the winger did his job. He got forward, stood the defender up. The wing-back charged forward, and they lost the ball. And so the wing-back is so dangerously committed that he's lost the ball, that when United then came out, that's why the first goal, 𝗤𝗿 has basically the freedom of the pitch down that left-hand side, because their wing-back is so far committed, and there is neither of those 2 central midfielders dropping in to cover the space. They're not covering themselves defensively. They're going all out for the chaotic attack to create those overloads in space, and they actually created United's overload for the goal. With the second goal, you see it even more obviously. They've not even got the winger to stand up the defender. They've not created that overload. They're not in a position to create the overload, and let the wing-back still commits himself. He has still stepped forward and moved on, which means that when 𝗍𝗏 receives the ball, if you pick a still of that moment, their wing-back is beyond 𝗍𝗏. So 𝗍𝗏's got the ball in the centre of the box here, in centre of midfield here. Their fullback is committed towards United box, and there is a massive gap between the 2 centre halves, which is just, it's basically an invitation to say, Ben Brereton Diaz, just run down there. It's the most straightforward run and the straightforward finish you're ever going to get. 𝗍𝗏 has to perfectly weight that pass. But in all honesty, they'd made it easy for him. They'd given him a huge target to hit and made it straightforward to United to be able to create that goal. So always back up your attacking with an actual defensive structure. If you're going to commit wing-backs as high as they're going to do that, you've got to tell one of your midfielders, you sit in, you cover that space. You don't just give them an easy target to play these balls into, because it's so straightforward and you are always going to be hurt. And I think that sums up why they are where they are this season. I was convinced they were going to be one of the best teams in this division, but the way that they're coached, the way that they've organised themselves defensively is just absolute carnage. It is absolute carnage, and you're never going to be successful doing that. The only way their system works is if they have 70% possession, because as soon as the other team get the ball, they are going to hurt you in that kind of defensive organisation, because there is nothing there. They've got the structure all wrong. And I think there's lessons to be learnt there for United, just to make sure that as we start to dominate games more, we keep that defensive organisation. We got hurt by it against Hull. I think we've learnt our lesson with how we're organising our midfield, but we just need to make sure we keep that going forward. Now, we've talked about United against Boro. We've talked a little bit about United against Portsmouth. But what about United against Luton? How do we need to approach this game? What is going to be different about Luton's approach to Boro's? Well, Luton are probably going to play a bit like Portsmouth, if we're being honest. They're not going to focus on build-up through midfield. They're going to try and play in transition. They're going to play the long ball up over the top to 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗹𝗍, or Morris, shall we say. And so it's going to be similar, where the physical vulnerability of United's two centre-halves is really going to be exposed. They're going to want to be pushing them back towards United's box. They're going to use them to stretch the play, get United's central defence deeper and deeper and deeper, and create a huge gap between the defence and the midfield. They're then going to try and force themselves into those spaces to win the second ball. So Souza's role, and giving him that freedom to really pick up on that sort of defensive midfield area, is going to be crucial. If he can play it the way that he played it against Middlesbrough, where he's got free reign to just go and win the ball, to always be the man who's picking up the runner, who's following the man coming through from midfield, then he should be able to cover the way that they're going to try and play. It should mean that they don't have that space to win the ball high and get it out to the wingers in the same way that Portsmouth did. It's also a huge expectation on Clark and on Burrows. Because let's say we get that first phase wrong. Souza can't be everywhere. He's not going to win every single second ball. So 𝗍𝗿𝗄 pushes the defenders back, the ball drops, and one of their midfielders is the first onto it, running towards United's goal. What they're going to want to try and do is get it out to the wingers, so it's going to go probably down the left, I would imagine, and they're going to try and run at Harry Clark in the same way that Murphy did for Portsmouth. In this game, Clark can't afford to give them the easy crossing into the box that he did against Portsmouth. We are not going to get away with that again. So he's got to be closer to his man. And he's got to make sure that once they're sort of in the final third, as they like to call it, he's blocking everything that's trying to go into the box. It's got to be a contended cross. You can't just say, right, pick your man and put it on his head, because we will lose this game if he's able to do that. So ultimately, there is very much a way that we can nullify the way that Luton get forward. They, at the moment, are not a very good team. So we know their plan, but if we're being honest, at the minute, they cannot execute that plan effectively. United definitely can execute their defensive positioning excellently, as we've just seen against Boro. We are capable of making sure that they're not able to pen us in. It's a different style of game, but we've just landed on a midfield sort of partnership, which is really going to allow us to win that seconds, shall we say, in midfield. I think Souza having free reign is going to be crucial to us being effective in this game. So I wouldn't put 𝗏𝗏𝗲 back in. I would keep that partnership of Peck and Souza and really utilise that in terms of the way that we can spin them. And so even if 𝗍𝗿𝗄 wins first contact, as long as Souza wins the second and we're able to play those early balls into Gustavo Harmer, I think that will give us everything we need to be creative. Ultimately, if we play to the level that we're capable of, both in and out of possession, the way that we did against Middlesbrough, we will win this game. There are not many teams who will be able to deal with that. So stick to the same system, stick to what's worked well, but just make sure we've got that additional cover in defence, that we're not relying on the physical attributes of Ennell and Robinson, because that's where we're vulnerable and that's where they're going to come and hurt us. But ultimately, we are better than them. So let's go out, stamp our authority on the game, win it 2-1, because football can just be that simple. Now, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into a couple of tactical tweaks that gave us the edge against Middlesbrough. I've certainly enjoyed looking into it, having a look at the game, just watching it with a slightly different eye to see if we can pick out what these tweaks and changes look like. So if you have enjoyed it, let us know in the comments and we can do more videos like this going forwards. Let's hope we go into this one, win again against Luton. And actually, all that matters is the result. We talk about tactics and I really enjoy getting into it. But as long as United are winning, let's say that's what matters the most. 𝗚𝗿𝗄𝗍𝗄𝗏